Sunday morning felt ordinary until it didn't. The kind of ordinary that Benjamin Clark had known for 73 years, the pre-dawn silence. The smell of coffee measuring time, the creak of floorboards that had learned the rhythm of his steps. He had spent a lifetime rising before the sun, sorting mail into neat stacks that connected strangers, tending plants on a fire escape that faced an alley, and folding hymns into his shirt pocket for the walk to Greater Emmanuel Baptist Church. His hands knew work the way some people know leisure. His face carried the particular dignity of a black man who had survived decades of small humiliations by being twice as punctual, 3 times as polite and unfailingly, exhaustingly correct in every interaction that mattered to white people in positions of power. That Sunday, in the marble-floored lobby of the building he had called home for 23 years, Vincent Castellano, the new landlord, a man whose grandfather had probably never touched a mailbag or felt the ache of standing for 8 hours, looked at Benjamin's worn Sunday shoes and called him garbage. Not as metaphor, not as frustration, as a statement of value. The word hung in the air like a slur, precise and calculated, designed to reduce a human being to waste. It landed not as mere noise but as a legal threat, the opening salvo in a paperwork war designed to erase 23 years of rent receipts, holiday cards exchanged with neighbors, the pencil marks on a doorframe that measured a boy's growth. From age 7 to 17. Vincent Castellano thought too elderly. Black faces would fold under the pressure of bureaucracy and intimidation. That the mathematics of age plus race plus fixed income equaled inevitable displacement. He calculated that dignity had a price ceiling, that memory could be evicted with the right forms filed in the right sequence. He was wrong. The secret the landlord never saw coming, the one detail his demographic research and market analysis had missed would change everything. And when it emerged, when the truth walked through that same marble lobby in a tailored suit with the power of law behind it, the building itself learned what dignity looks like when it refuses to be priced out of its own story. Benjamin and Dorothy Clark had made ritual out of ordinary things, the kind of daily practices that become invisible until they're threatened. Sunday shirts pressed on Saturday night, starch measured to the half teaspoon. Coffee poured at 6:47 a.m., not because of any alarm but because Benjamin's body had internalized postal service hours across 3 decades. A photograph touched each. Morning-weathered fingers on glass, a small prayer spoken without sound. Their apartment at 447 Morningside Terrace carried memory like a quiet museum, each object a time stamp in a marriage that had survived what survival required. The living room held graduation photos. Isaiah in his cap and gown, 1998, the first in their family to finish college. A faded newspaper clipping was tucked in the corner of the frame, Local Youth Overcomes Adversity. Accepted to Howard University. The plants on the fire escape were tended like small promises, each one adopted from neighbors who moved away. From church members who passed, from the corner bodega when Mr. Kim retired. The jade plant had belonged to Mrs. Patterson in 4C, gone now 15 years. The African violet came from Greater Emmanuel's Easter service in 2004. Dorothy knew every provenance, every story. This was her archive. Benjamin had given his best years to the United States Postal Service, 31 years of sorting mail in a facility where he was always Ben to supervisors, who couldn't be bothered with the formality of his full name, where promotions went to younger white men who called him Chief and Buddy, where his complaints about racist jokes were filed in drawers that never opened. He had learned the bitter arithmetic early. A black man's excellence had to be constant and invisible. Spectacular enough to be undeniable, but quiet enough not to threaten. He delivered that excellence in 6-day increments year after year. Until his knees knew the route better than his mind. Dorothy had given decades to Sunday school at Greater Emmanuel, teaching children whose parents worked double shifts that they were loved by God even when the world suggested otherwise. She had wiped noses and mediated disputes and made sure every child knew at least one adult who would show up, who would remember their birthday, who would never call them a burden. She had stretched food stamp budgets into holiday meals, turned thrift store finds into Easter outfits, and showed up to parent-teacher conferences for children whose own parents couldn't get time off work. Her labor was the invisible infrastructure that kept families from collapsing. Rent was paid on the 1st, always. Not the 3rd, not when the grace period expired, but on the 1st. Benjamin walked the check to the management office personally, every month for 23 years, and waited for the receipt. He filed those receipts in an accordion folder organized by year, because he knew that for people who looked like him, proof was survival. Neighbors knew Benjamin and Dorothy as steady hands and kind smiles, the couple who held the door, who signed for packages, who checked on Mrs. Washington when she had the flu, who organized the building's first and only community meeting about. The broken elevator in 2011, their home, was proof that stability could be built without spectacle, that Black lives could be ordinary in the best sense of the word, routine, predictable, safe. Not cinematic, not tragic, not requiring rescue or representation. Just the quiet accumulation of days that add up to a life, asterisk across town, in an office with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking a park that had once been a Black neighborhood before. Urban renewal. Vincent Castellano measured value in market rate and renovation photos. His father had built the family's portfolio on rent-controlled apartments in neighborhoods in transition, the euphemism that meant Black and brown people being systematically pushed out as property values climbed. Vincent had inherited not just buildings but a philosophy. Neighborhoods were products, tenants were temporary, and sentiment was bad business. He saw demographics, not people. A heat map showing median income by census tract. A spreadsheet calculating the delta between current rents and market rate. A presentation deck for investors showing before and after photos where before meant darker faces in the lobby and after meant white couples with expensive strollers. Vincent had learned from his father that you didn't need to say the racist part out loud if the numbers did the talking. You didn't need to use slurs if you could use terms like neighborhood, transformation and amenity upgrade, and tenant quality. The building at 447 Morningside Terrace had been purchased as part of a portfolio of 14 rent-stabilized properties in rapidly gentrifying areas. The math was simple. Current tenants paid an average of $847 per month. Market rate for comparable units was $2,400. Each month, a long-term tenant. Remained was $1,553 in unrealized value. Multiply that across 68 rent-stabilized units in the building. Multiply that by 12 months, and you arrived at a seven-figure problem that had to be solved. A water stain on a ceiling in the Clarks. Apartment reported by Dorothy. In 2019, again in 2020, and again in 2021, each time ignored became the seed for paperwork. Vincent's property manager, a man named Derek Moss, who had mastered the art of looking concerned while doing nothing, scheduled a routine inspection for October 2023. The inspection was staged with the precision of theater. Photographs taken from angles that made minor wear look like hazardous conditions. Notes recorded in language borrowed from building code violations. Timestamps documented to suggest a pattern of negligence by the tenants rather than the landlord. Small. Bureaucratic phrases were chosen like tools from a toolbox. Habitability concerns. Unauthorized occupants. Lease violations. Failure to maintain. Each phrase had legal weight. Precedent, a history of successful evictions behind it. For Vincent Castellano, the arithmetic was simple: raise the pressure, manufacture the paper trail, wait for the inevitable. Elderly tenants, especially Black elderly tenants on fixed incomes, rarely had the resources to fight. They moved to cheaper buildings farther from their communities, or to live with relatives, or into the precarious world of sublets and couches. They disappeared from the neighborhood story, and new tenants arrived who could afford the asking price. For Benjamin and Dorothy Clark, the stakes were home, memory, and 47 years of marriage that had weathered enough storms without. Adding this one, they kept living the quiet life that makes words like tenant mean more than a line on a ledger. That transforms apartment into the only place where their history was still visible on the walls. That quiet was about to be tested by a machinery designed to grind it into silence. The slow violence of bureaucracy. The first months were a steady drip. The kind of pressure that doesn't announce itself with drama, but with the accumulation of small violations. It started with a clipboard at dawn 6:15 a.m. on a Tuesday. Derek Moss and a man identified only as building inspector, knocking on the door while Dorothy was still in her nightgown. Benjamin, already dressed for his morning walk, answered to find a camera phone already recording. A checklist already prepared. Questions designed to catch rather than clarify. How many people reside at this address? 2. My wife and myself. Has anyone else stayed here in the past 6 months? Our son visits, he doesn't live here. How frequently? The questions came with the affect of neutrality, but Benjamin recognized the tone. It was the same tone he'd heard from postal supervisors. Investigating minor discrepancies, the assumption of guilt dressed up as procedure. He answered each question precisely, offered access to every room, watched as photographs were taken of the water stain that had been reported and ignored for years, of a loose tile in the bathroom, of a window seal that needed replacing, all maintenance issues that were the landlord's responsibility but would somehow be recorded as evidence of tenant neglect. Within 2 weeks, complaints that had never been filed appeared as sworn claims in official correspondence. A noise complaint dated September 12th, signed by a tenant in 5B, except Mrs. Chun in 5B had moved out in July and the new tenant hadn't moved in until October. A claim of smoke odor attributed to their unit, despite neither Benjamin nor Dorothy smoking and no smoke detectors ever triggering. An allegation of improper disposal of refuse that cited the wrong unit number in the body of the complaint, but had their apartment number on the routing. Benjamin cataloged everything the way he had sorted mail for 31 years. He kept copies, dated every call, photographed every piece of correspondence before opening it. He showed the discrepancies to neighbors who remembered the same faces, the same quiet routines. Mrs. Washington in 3A confirmed she'd never filed a noise complaint. Mr. Okonkwo in 6C confirmed he'd been approached by Derek Moss and asked to sign a statement about building concerns, but had refused when he read the details and realized they were fabrications. The harassment escalated with bureaucratic precision. A water shutoff lasted 6 hours on a Thursday afternoon, blamed on emergency repairs that no one witnessed. The elevator was placed out of service for 3 days, requiring Dorothy, whose knees carried the pain of 7 decades, to climb 4 flights of stairs to reach their apartment. When Benjamin called to complain, he was told that accommodations could be made, temporary relocation to a first-floor unit, if they were willing to sign a new lease at market rate. The trap was elegant. Refuse and suffer, accept and lose the rent stabilization that made the apartment. Affordable dot notices came folded in the mailbox like small detonations. 30 days to remedy violations that were either fabricated or the landlord's responsibility. Lists of invented infractions that ignored decades of proof and routine kindness. Claims that suggested Benjamin and Dorothy were operating a business from the apartment, that they had modified the electrical system, that they were housing unauthorized occupants. Each letter rewired the apartment's atmosphere, turned home into contested territory, made every sound in the hallway a potential threat. Asterisk Dorothy pressed her palms to the refrigerator and watched her hands tremble while the photograph of a boy in a graduation robe looked back. Isaiah at 18, standing in front of Howard University's Founders Library, wearing a smile that had taken 11 years of patient love to build. The yellowed newspaper clipping tucked into the corner of the frame told a story the landlord's paperwork couldn't account for. Local youth overcomes adversity. They had raised a child nobody wanted. A 7-year-old boy pulled from a foster system that had failed him in every measurable way. A child who arrived with a garbage bag of clothes and a file folder of trauma assessments. The social worker had been blunt. He's been in 6 homes. In 3 years. Behavioral issues. Attachment disorder. He needs structure and patience, and I'll be honest with you, most families give up. Benjamin and Dorothy had not given up. They had absorbed the tantrums and the silence, the nightmares and the theft of small objects, the testing and retesting of whether love was conditional. They had attended the parent-teacher conferences where Isaiah's white teachers suggested medication and lower expectations. They had sat through the meetings where school administrators recommended alternative placement, a euphemism for pushing black boys out of mainstream classrooms. They had showed up to every counseling session, every court date, every IEP meeting, and demonstrated that consistency could be its own form of healing. By 8th grade, Isaiah was making honor roll. By 11th grade, he was taking AP classes and applying to colleges. By 18, he was giving a speech at Greater Emmanuel Baptist Church about second chances and stubborn love. The Clarks had loved him not because it was easy, but because they believed that black children deserved the kind of relentless commitment that white children received as birthright. They had turned a child the system classified as a liability into a young man who would go on to law school, who would clerk for a federal judge, who would build a career on the belief that justice was possible if you worked hard enough and documented everything. But proof alone does not stop a campaign built on money and silence. Dorothy had the receipts, the report cards, the photographs, the letters from teachers and social workers and church members testifying to Isaiah's transformation. She had evidence that their home was a place where life-changing love had occurred. But Vincent Castellano's paperwork didn't have a box for that. His forms didn't ask whether a family had raised a child through trauma into triumph. His eviction notice didn't care that this apartment held memories that couldn't be relocated to a cheaper zip code. Asterisk, day by day, humiliation expanded into performance. Vincent Castellano began staging inspections the way a director stages a play, complete with audience. He invited potential tenants, always white, always young, always visibly affluent, to tour the building during hours when long-term tenants were most likely to be visible. He walked these prospective renters past Benjamin in the lobby, past Mrs. Washington struggling with her groceries, past Mr. Okonkwo's grandchildren playing in the hallway, and described a building in transition. "We're upgrading the tenant experience," he would say, letting the phrase hang in the air with its obvious subtext. The current tenants, black, elderly, working class, were the before in his renovation narrative. The white couples nodding along were the after. The performance required no explicit racism. The staging did the work. The lobby became a theater, where Vincent performed exclusion for an invited audience. He photographed irrelevant stains with professional lighting, whispered to contractors about problem units, made sure his voice carried when he discussed quality of life issues within earshot of long-term residents. He cultivated an atmosphere where the Clarks and their neighbors were made to feel like trespassers in their own building. Obstacles to progress, relics of a neighborhood that needed to be erased for property values to climb. People who witnessed the cruelty looked away. Some out of embarrassment, the particular discomfort white liberals feel when confronted with racism they're not sure how to name. Some out of fear of conflict, worried that intervening might make them targets. Some out of the small moral calculus that lets injustice breathe in public. It's not my problem, I don't want to get involved. Surely someone else will do something. The silence was as strategic as the harassment. Vincent was counting on it. The couple's world shrank to paperwork and whispered rumors. Dorothy stopped going to the building's community room for the monthly resident meetings because the new property manager had restructured them into stakeholder sessions that only notified certain tenants. Benjamin stopped chatting with neighbors in the lobby because every conversation felt surveilled, as if friendliness itself might be weaponized as evidence of unauthorized assembly. They began to move through their own building like ghosts, trying to be invisible enough to avoid attention but present enough to assert their right to remain. Asterisk then, on a Tuesday in March, the official notice arrived. Not slipped under the door or taped to the frame, but delivered by process server, a legal ritual designed to add weight and fear. In one crisp envelope, 23 years threatened to be reclassified as a liability. The language was precise: failure to remedy violations, breach of lease terms, incompatibility with building standards. The remedy was relocation within 60 days or eviction proceedings would commence. For the first time in their marriage, fear moved through their home with a new force. Not the fear of poverty, they had known that. Not the fear of racism, they had survived that. But the fear of erasure, of being removed from the only place where their story was still written on the walls, where the pencil marks measuring Isaiah's growth were still visible on the doorframe, where the congregation from. Greater Emmanuel knew to find them, where their history had weight and presence. Dorothy cried that night in a way Benjamin hadn't seen since her mother's funeral. Not the tears of sadness, but the tears of rage at injustice, at the particular cruelty of being told at 70 years old that your life's work of stability and care could be undone by a man who saw you as a line item on a spreadsheet. Benjamin held her and felt his own helplessness like a physical weight, the accumulated exhaustion of 73 years of being twice as good and still being treated as disposable. Asterisk. Isaiah Clarke watched from the edge of a life built by other people's assumptions about what a black boy from foster care could achieve. At 33, he was a senior litigator at Morrison & Foley, a firm that did not typically take tenants' rights cases but made exceptions for corporate clients facing discrimination claims. He wore suits that cost more than his parents' monthly rent. worked in an office with a view of the harbor, and carried the particular burden of being the diversity hire, who had to be exceptional enough to justify his existence while never being so exceptional that he threatened white mediocrity. His childhood had been a lesson in rescue. A small boy pulled from motionlessness, not drowning but floating, not fighting but surrendering into a household that made space where there had been none. He remembered the first night in the Clarks' apartment, lying awake in a bedroom that was his alone, waiting for the inevitable disappointment, for the moment when these new adults would realize he was too broken to fix and send him back into the system's rotation. That moment never came. Instead came morning routines and assigned chores and patient correction when he tested boundaries. Came Benjamin teaching him to fold a letter the way postal workers fold letters, with crisp corners and respect for what was inside. Came Dorothy showing him how to measure ingredients, explaining that recipes were promises you kept to yourself. Came years of tiny hands finding their fingers in parking lots, of being claimed in public when other foster children learned to expect invisibility. Now those hands were trembling on the phone as Dorothy explained the notices, the inspections, the manufactured violations. Isaiah listened with the dual consciousness of a son and a lawyer, hearing both the fear in his mother's voice and the legal pattern underneath. This wasn't personal harassment, it was systematic displacement. The kind of case he'd seen in law school hypotheticals and bar exam questions, but had never confronted in the intimate space of his own origin story. When the call ended, it moved through him like a call to arms. Not to settle a bill, but to answer a moral demand that had been planted in him the first time Benjamin had showed up to a foster care review meeting in his postal uniform. The first time Dorothy had sat in a courtroom and said, "Yes, we'll take him home." This was not a private fight between a landlord and his parents. It was a pattern. Isaiah spent the next 72 hours doing what his parents had taught him: documentation. He requested copies of all building violations filed in the past 5 years. He pulled property records showing Vincent Castellano's purchase history. He found news articles about tenant displacement in other buildings the Castellano family owned. He discovered a pattern that was hiding in plain sight: elderly black tenants, sudden violations, swift evictions, units re-rented at triple the price to white professionals. He found emails obtained through a legal request that his firm's resources made possible, where Vincent instructed Derek Moss to be creative about removal strategies for rent-stabilized units. He found text messages discussing which tenants would fight back and which would fold quietly. He found a presentation deck pitched to investors that literally labeled long-term tenants as legacy obstacles, to be resolved through strategic attrition. The rising actions stopped being personal and became structural. This wasn't about saving his parents, though he would do that. It was about stopping a machine that had been grinding black families out of their homes while the law looked the other way. The battlefield had changed. Isaiah wasn't just a son anymore. He was evidence. He was leverage. He was the secret weapon that Vincent Castellano's demographic research had missed. The foster child who became a lawyer. The liability who became the litigation. And he was about to make a house call. Asterisk. The moment of reckoning arrived not as a shout, but as a deliberate crossing of thresholds. The kind of entrance that changes the atmospheric pressure of a room. It was a Tuesday morning, 9:47 a.m., and Vincent Castellano was in the building's management office reviewing a contractor's bid for lobby renovations, marble counters, brass fixtures, the aesthetic signifiers that would telegraph to prospective white renters that this was no longer that kind of neighborhood. Through the window, he saw a tailored car glide into the parking lot. Black Mercedes, recent model, the kind of vehicle that belonged to the building's future rather than its present. A young black man emerged wearing a suit that Vincent's practiced eye recognized as bespoke, carrying a leather briefcase that wasn't performative but functional. The man moved with the particular confidence of someone who knew exactly how much power he carried and exactly how to deploy it. Isaiah Clark walked through the lobby with measured steps. Past the marble floor where his father had been called. Garbage past the mailboxes where 23 years of notices had been delivered. Past the directory where Clark B&D was still listed in fading label maker print. He nodded to Mrs. Washington, who was collecting her mail. He smiled at Mr. Okonkwo's grandchildren who were waiting for the elevator. He moved through the space like someone who belonged because he did. This building held the only childhood. He could remember choosing him. Derek Moss, the property manager, intercepted him in the hallway. "Can I help you? Are you here for a viewing?" The question carried its own assumptions. A young black man in an expensive suit must be looking to rent, must be part of the demographic shift, must be here to join the displacement rather than resist it. Derek had perfected the art of seeing race before seeing person, of sorting humans into economic categories before learning their names. "I'm here to see Mr. Castellano," Isaiah said, his voice carrying the neutral tone that black professionals. Master early friendly enough not to be threatening, firm enough not to be dismissed. "I don't have an appointment, but I think he'll want to take this meeting." "Regarding?" "A legal matter concerning this property." Derek's expression shifted through several calculations. Dismiss this man, call security, or defer to Vincent's judgment. He chose deference, leading Isaiah to the office where Vincent sat surrounded by renovation plans that would erase the building's history in favor of its profitability. Vincent looked up, his face arranging itself into the practiced smile of a man who sold apartments for a living. "Mr. Castellano," Isaiah said, not waiting for introduction. "My name is Isaiah Clark. I'm an attorney with Morrison and Foley, and I represent Benjamin and Dorothy Clark, residents of Unit 4D. The smile calcified. Vincent's mind was already moving through scenarios, legal strategies, the cost-benefit analysis of settlement versus litigation. But he hadn't yet understood what was standing in front of him. "The Clarks," Isaiah continued, placing his briefcase on the desk with deliberate care, "are my parents, and I'm here to discuss the systematic campaign of harassment, discrimination, and illegal eviction attempts you've directed against them and other long-term black residents of this building." The office became a courtroom without a judge. Isaiah opened his briefcase and began laying documents on Vincent's desk like evidence in a trial that had already reached its verdict. Each page was a careful excavation of the machinery Vincent had built to displace families like the Clarks. "Let's start with the basics," Isaiah said, his voice carrying the pedagogical tone of someone who had taught this lesson before. "Fair Housing Act 42 U.S.C. Section 3604. It is unlawful to discriminate in the terms, conditions, or privileges of sale or rental of a dwelling because of race. The pattern of harassment directed at my parents constitutes discrimination in the terms and conditions of their tenancy." He placed a document on the desk, a spreadsheet showing every rent-stabilized tenant in the building, their race, their age, and the date they received violation notices. The pattern was undeniable. Black tenants over 60 had received an average of 4.7 violation notices in the past 18 months. White tenants in the same age bracket had received 0.3. The numbers told the story that Vincent's emails had confirmed. This was targeted, strategic, racial. "Here's the correspondence between you and Mr. Moss," Isaiah continued, placing printed emails on the desk. "Be creative about removal strategies for legacy units. Priority targets are 3A, 4D, 6C, 7B. All units occupied by elderly black tenants. We need to move faster on the 4th floor. That's premium light. That's my parents' floor, Mr. Castellano. Premium light. As if their lives are blocking your view." Vincent's confident script began to fray. "Those emails are taken out of context. We have legitimate building concerns. The water stain in my parents' ceiling," Isaiah interrupted, "was reported by my mother in May 2019. She has the work order. She called again in March 2020, August 2020, January 2021. Each time she was told it would be addressed. It wasn't. Then, conveniently, in October 2023, that same water stain becomes a habitability violation attributed to tenant neglect. Would you like to explain how a leak that the landlord ignored for 4 years suddenly becomes the tenant's responsibility?" He placed another document, a maintenance log showing Dorothy's repeated requests, Derek's dismissive responses, and finally the violation notice that blamed the Clarks for conditions the landlord had created through deliberate neglect. The noise complaint filed by Mrs. Chun in 5B dated September 12, 2023, except Mrs. Chain moved out in July 2023. I have her forwarding address, her new lease, and a signed affidavit stating she never filed any such complaint. Someone in this office forged that document. That's not creative property management, Mr. Castellano. That's fraud. Vincent's face had gone pale, the particular pallor of a man watching his certainties collapse. He had built his career on the assumption that elderly black tenants wouldn't fight back, that they lacked the resources, the knowledge, the connections to challenge his methods. He had calculated that Benjamin and Dorothy Clark were just two more obstacles to be removed through paperwork and pressure. He had never imagined that the garbage bag kid they'd taken in would grow up to be the litigation that could destroy him. You've filed false complaints, manufactured violations, and engaged in a pattern of harassment designed to force long-term residents out of rent-stabilized housing, Isaiah said, his voice steady and relentless. That's not just a fair housing violation. Under state law, that's criminal tenant harassment. Penal Code Section 241B, a misdemeanor that becomes a felony when it targets multiple victims. And Mr. Castellano, you have multiple victims. He placed another document, statements from Mrs. Washington, Mr. Okonkwo, the Rodriguez family in 7B. The Johnsons in 3 Key, all elderly, all black or brown, all subjected to the same pattern of violations, water shutoffs, elevator outages, and eviction threats. All documented, all dated, all witnessed. I've filed complaints with the Department of Housing Preservation and Development, the New York State Division of Human Rights, and the Attorney General's Office. I've also prepared a federal lawsuit under the Fair Housing Act with a class of plaintiffs that includes every current and former tenant you've targeted. The damages will be substantial, but more importantly, the publicity will be worse. Vincent tried to regroup to find the leverage he usually wielded. You're threatening me? Do you know how many lawyers I have on retainer? Your firm does work. For companies I invest in, had, Isaiah corrected. Past tense. I've already informed my firm that I'm taking a leave of absence to pursue this matter personally. I don't need Morrison and Foley's resources. I need their conflict waiver, which I have. So your business relationships with my former employer are irrelevant to this case. What is relevant is the evidence, Mr. Castellano, and the evidence is damning. Asterisk, the confrontation was procedural and merciless. A systematic dismantling of every assumption Vincent had made about power and immunity. Isaiah wasn't performing anger or seeking catharsis. He was executing a legal strategy that had been built with the same patience his parents had shown in raising him. Document everything. Trust the process. Believe that persistence can bend. Systems that seem immovable. Here's what happens next, Isaiah said, organizing the documents into a single stack that represented months of investigation. HPD is conducting an inspection of this building next Tuesday. Not the kind of inspection you stage for cameras. A real inspection. They'll find code violations you've ignored while manufacturing fake ones against my parents. They'll interview tenants you've been trying to silence. They'll review maintenance records that show a pattern of neglect toward rent-stabilized units. He placed a subpoena on the desk. The Attorney General's office is also interested in your business practices, particularly the investor presentations where you describe tenant displacement as strategic attrition. There's a task force investigating landlord harassment in gentrifying neighborhoods. You're now a case study. Vincent's hands trembled slightly as he reached for the subpoena, scanning language that transformed his business model into a criminal investigation. Everything he had built, the portfolio, the renovations, the narrative of neighborhood improvement was being reclassified as evidence of systematic discrimination. You can fight this, Isaiah continued, and we can spend the next 3 years in litigation while every newspaper in the city runs stories about the landlord who tried to evict the elderly black couple who raised a foster child. I have reporters interested in this story. I have community organizations ready to protest. I have elected officials who want to make tenant harassment a campaign issue. Or he let the word hang in the air, offering a lifeline that came with conditions. Or you can settle. You drop all eviction proceedings against my parents and the other tenants I represent. You pay damages for the harassment 6 figures, split among the affected families. You agree to a consent decree monitored by the Attorney General's office. That prevents this behavior in your other properties. You sell this building to a nonprofit affordable housing organization at a price that reflects its current rent roll, not its gentrified potential. And you do all of this quietly with an NDA that keeps your name out of the press. Vincent looked at the man standing in his office and saw, perhaps for the first time, Not a demographic category, but a consequence. Saw the child he had never bothered to imagine when he looked at the Clark's file. The life that had been built in apartment 4D through stubborn love and relentless presence. Saw the litigation that happens when you underestimate people based on age, race, and a parent. Powerlessness. "You're destroying my business," Vincent said. The complaint of a man who had built wealth on the displacement of others and couldn't comprehend why that might warrant consequences. "No," Isaiah corrected, his voice carrying a hardness that came from watching his mother cry over eviction notices. "You destroyed your business when you decided that profit mattered more than people's homes. When you looked at my father and called him garbage. When you calculated that elderly Black lives were obstacles to premium rents. I'm just making sure the destruction is documented." The settlement negotiations took 6 hours. Lawyers were called. Terms were drafted, numbers were calculated and recalculated. Vincent fought every concession like a man defending territory he believed was rightfully his. But the evidence was insurmountable, the legal exposure was catastrophic, and the alternative to settlement was a very public trial where every email, every forged complaint, every strategic water shutoff would be entered into the record and reported in the news. By 4 p.m., the agreement was signed. The Clarks and 7 other families would receive settlements totaling $840,000. All eviction proceedings would be dropped immediately. The building would be sold to Morningside Community Land Trust within 90 days, ensuring permanent affordability for current residents. Vincent Castellano would pay an additional $200,000 fine to the Attorney General's office and submit to monitoring of his other properties for 5 years. But the settlement wasn't the climax. The climax came at 5:30 p.m., when investigators from the Attorney General's office arrived with a warrant. Because while Isaiah had been negotiating civil remedies, the criminal investigation had been proceeding on a parallel track. The forged complaints weren't just civil fraud, they were criminal fraud. The manufactured violations weren't just harassment, they were false instrument filing, a felony. Vincent Castellano was arrested in his own building in the lobby he had planned to renovate, surrounded by the tenants he had tried to erase. The handcuffs closed around his wrists while Mrs. Washington watched from the mailboxes, while Mr. Okonkwo's grandchildren peered around the corner, while Benjamin and Dorothy Clark stood with their son and watched a different kind of justice arrive. The cameras that Vincent had used to surveil and intimidate his tenants were now recording his perp walk. The marble floor where he had performed exclusion became the stage for his humiliation. The building that he had tried to transform into a monument to, gentrification, became the site of his legal collapse. Isaiah stood with his arms around his parents and felt the weight of the moment, not triumph. Exactly, but vindication. The belief that documentation matters, that persistence can outlast power, that love can build weapons against cruelty. His mother was crying again, but different tears this time. His father's hand gripped his shoulder with a strength that belied 73 years. "Thank you," Benjamin whispered, his voice carrying the tremor of held-back emotion. "You taught me how," Isaiah replied. "You taught me that people who look like us have to be twice as good and keep twice as many records. You taught me that showing up matters. That consistency is its own form of resistance." When the handcuffs closed, the building's air shifted. The tenants who had been moving through the hallways like ghosts, trying to avoid attention, suddenly stood straighter. The atmosphere of fear that Vincent had cultivated through staged inspections and manufactured violations lifted like smoke clearing from a room. The story that had been crafted to erase a family was now the story that exposed a network of manipulation, greed, and racism disguised as business strategy. The payoff was not a stunt, but a demonstration. Systematic harassment can be dismantled when people document, speak, and refuse to be erased. When communities organize instead of isolate. When the children raised with love grow up to be the litigation that power never saw coming. The landlord, once a figure of untouchable entitlement, became an object lesson in consequences. And the building learned what dignity looks like when it refuses to be priced out of its own story. After the legal thunder, the apartment settled into light. The kind of light that comes after a storm clearer, sharper, earned. Repairs that had been ignored for years suddenly happened with remarkable efficiency. The water stain in the ceiling was fixed within 48 hours of the new management taking over. The elevator, which had been temporarily out of service for weeks at strategic intervals, was repaired and modernized. Water ran without mysterious interruptions. Heat arrived on schedule. The settlement money arrived in 3 installments, processed through an escrow account that Isaiah monitored personally. Benjamin and Dorothy received $127,000 compensation for 23 months of documented harassment, emotional distress, and the violation of their right to quiet enjoyment of their home. They used part of it to finally take the trip to Ghana they had postponed for decades, to visit the land their ancestors had been stolen from, to stand on soil that remembered them even if they couldn't remember it. They used another portion to establish a fund at Greater Emmanuel Baptist Church, the Second Chance Scholarship, awarded annually to a former foster youth pursuing higher education. The first recipient was a 17-year-old girl named Jasmine who had been in the system since age 9, who wanted to study social work, who reminded Dorothy of the small boy who had arrived with a garbage bag and left for college with matched luggage and a future, but more importantly than money, the building itself changed. Morningside Community Land Trust assumed ownership with a mandate to preserve affordability in perpetuity. The new management model was cooperative tenants had voting representation on the board. Maintenance requests were tracked on a public dashboard, rent increases were capped at inflation, and long-term residents were protected from displacement. A plaque was installed in the lobby, not as decoration but as declaration. This building stands as a community commons dedicated to the principle that housing is a human right, not a commodity. In memory of all those displaced by greed and in honor of those who fought to remain. May we never forget that our neighbor's dignity is inseparable from our own. The plaque did not restore the lost months of fear, the sleepless nights, the trembling hands on eviction notices. But it did mark a shift in what the community expected from itself, that people would not be priced out of memory, that elderly residents would not be harassed out of homes they had occupied for decades, that the word neighbor would mean something more than proximity. Dorothy and Benjamin returned to rituals with different textures. Sunday morning still meant pressed shirts and coffee at 6:47 a.m., but now it also meant phone calls from reporters asking about their experience, from tenant advocacy groups asking them to speak at rallies, from other elderly residents and other buildings asking how they had fought back, and one. Benjamin became an unlikely community organizer, attending housing court with neighbors facing eviction, teaching them the system he had learned through necessity. He showed them how to document everything, the dates, the times, the names, the receipts. He explained that for people who looked like them, proof wasn't paranoia but survival. He spoke at community board meetings in his postal worker's diction, precise and clear, about the mathematics of displacement and the human cost of gentrification. Dorothy continued her work at Greater Emmanuel, but now she also ran a tenant rights workshop every 3rd Saturday, teaching elderly Black and brown residents how to read their leases, how to file complaints with HPD, how to organize tenant associations, how to resist without risking retaliation. She had learned that the same patience she had applied to Sunday school, breaking down complex ideas into understandable pieces, repeating essential information, making people feel capable, applied to housing justice. Isaiah's presence was no longer a secret lever, but a lived consequence of love's investment. He didn't return to Morrison and Foley after his leave of absence. Instead, he joined the Legal Aid Society's housing practice, taking a 70% pay cut to represent tenants who couldn't afford the kind of lawyer he had been. He brought the resources and training of big law to the people who needed it most, turning corporate litigation skills into community defense. His first case after the Castellano settlement was representing the Rodriguez family in 7B, who were facing eviction from a different building owned by a different landlord, using the same playbook: manufactured violations, forged complaints, strategic neglect. Isaiah recognized the pattern because he had documented it. He won that case in 4 months, then another. Then another. Within 2 years, he had built a practice around one specific target: landlords who used harassment and discrimination to displace rent-stabilized tenants in gentrifying neighborhoods. He created a database of their tactics, shared it with other legal aid attorneys, trained law students in pattern recognition. He turned his parents' case into a methodology, a replicable strategy for resistance. The broader lesson: neighbors who had once stayed silent now shared stories, organized around a simple idea: the right to remain without being bullied out by manufactured violations. Building 447 Morningside Terrace became a model for tenant organizing across the city. Other buildings studied their cooperative structure, their maintenance transparency dashboard, their conflict resolution process. The lesson the Clark household left on the city was procedural as well as moral. Patterns of discrimination rely on paperwork, on the assumption that people will not document, that witnesses will not speak, that the legal machinery will be slower than eviction notices. Break that chain with dates, copies, neighbors, and persistent reporting, and the system bends the other way. But the system only bends when people push. It only bends when someone decides that the fear of retaliation is less important than the necessity of resistance. It only bends when documentation becomes communal practice, when neighbors stop looking away, when shame shifts from the victims of harassment to the perpetrators. The Clark case demonstrated that racist displacement doesn't happen in a vacuum. It requires the complicity of systems, the silence of witnesses, the isolation of victims. And it can be stopped by reversing each of those conditions: challenging systems with lawsuits, breaking silence with testimony, ending isolation with community organizing. Isaiah gave presentations at law schools about his parents' case, turning it into a teaching tool. He walked students through the evidence: the spreadsheet showing racial disparities in violation notices, the forged complaints, the emails discussing legacy obstacles. He explained how to build a fair housing case from fragments, how to connect individual harassment to systematic discrimination, how to transform scattered cruelty into documentable pattern. But his most important lesson wasn't legal, it was moral. My parents won, he would tell students, not because they had "allow your son," but because they had spent 23 years being the kind of neighbors people would testify for. Mrs. Washington didn't sign an affidavit because she owed them anything. She signed it because she knew them, because they had shown up for her, because community is built in ordinary moments that become extraordinary when tested. The story's deeper impact was quieter than headlines or settlements. Dignity does not come from a verdict or a lawsuit. It comes from the refusal to vanish. Benjamin and Dorothy could have accepted a bout, could have moved to a cheaper apartment farther from their church and their community, could have calculated that the fight wasn't worth the stress at their age. They didn't. They stayed. They documented. They asked for help. And in staying, they changed what was possible. So what should a witness do when they see the first clipboard, the first staged inspection, the first hush of a lobby where cruelty is being performed? The answer is both simple and demanding. Record the date. Write down what you saw when you saw it, who was present. Specific details matter in court. The landlord yelled at Mr. Clark is less useful than, on March 15, 2024, at approximately 9:30 a.m., I witnessed Vincent Castellano call Benjamin Clark garbage in the lobby while showing the building to prospective tenants. Save the email. Forward correspondence to a separate account. Take screenshots. Print physical copies. Digital evidence can be deleted, but paper persists. Create a folder, physical and digital, that organizes everything chronologically. Tell a neighbor, isolation is the tool of harassment. Community is the defense. When you witness something, share it with other residents. Break the silence that lets cruelty flourish. Contact an advocate. Every city has tenant rights organizations, legal aid services, fair housing councils. Google tenant rights, your city, and make the call. Most services are free. Most advocates are overworked but committed. They need to hear from you before the eviction notice arrives. Document patterns, not just incidents. 1 violation notice could be legitimate. 5 violation notices in 6 months to the same demographic is a pattern. Track dates. Compare experiences with neighbors. Build the spreadsheet that proves systematic discrimination. Know your rights. Fair Housing Act. Rent stabilization laws. Building codes. You don't need to be a lawyer, but you need to know enough to recognize when violations are manufactured versus legitimate. Resources exist, use them. Be willing to testify. The strongest cases have witnesses. If you see harassment, be prepared to sign an affidavit, to speak to investigators, to show up when it matters. Yes, this carries risk. Yes, it's uncomfortable. But silence guarantees that injustice continues. These small actions knit together into a defense strong enough to meet money and intent. Benjamin and Dorothy kept their home not because they were exceptional, but because they did ordinary things. Consistently, documented, asked for help, trusted their community, refused to let a life of ordinary rituals be erased by a landlord who saw them as obstacles to profit. That is the kind of courage any of us can practice the next time we see an injustice being staged in plain sight. Not the courage of heroes in movies, but the courage of keeping receipts, making phone calls, telling the truth, showing up. The courage of believing that our ordinary actions accumulated over time can bend systems that seem immovable. 5 years after Vincent Castellanos' arrest, Building 447 Morningside Terrace held a community celebration. Not a party, exactly, but a gathering potluck in the courtyard, children playing, old-timers telling stories, new residents learning the history that lived in the bricks. Benjamin and Dorothy sat in folding chairs, their hands clasped, watching. Isaiah's daughter, their granddaughter Chase, bubbles across the grass. The child was 3, adopted through the same foster system that had once labeled her father unadoptable. She had her grandfather's careful way of examining things and her grandmother's quick laugh. She had a family that would show up, a home that wouldn't disappear, a community that knew her name. Mrs. Washington brought them plates of food. Mr. Okonkwo's grandchildren performed a dance they'd learned in school. The Rodriguez family shared flan. New tenants introduced themselves, unaware that the quiet elderly couple in the corner had changed what tenure meant in this building. When someone asked Benjamin to speak, he stood slowly, his knees carrying the weight of 78 years, and said simply, "We stayed. That's all. We stayed when staying was hard. We documented when documentation felt useless. We asked for help when pride said to handle it alone. And we learned that home isn't just the place you live, it's the people who fight for you to keep living there." Dorothy added, her voice still, "Sunday school steady. And we learned that love isn't just what you feel, it's what you build. We built a life here, built a family here, built proof that we belonged. When someone tried to erase that, our community said no. That's the lesson. Community says no." Isaiah held his daughter and thought about the long arc from a garbage bag of clothes to this moment law degree. Family, a practice built on the belief that housing is a human right. He thought about the thousands of tenants he'd represented. The hundreds of cases won, the buildings saved, the families kept intact. All of it traced back to 2 people who saw a broken child and decided that love was a verb, that showing up was a strategy, that patience could be weaponized against cruelty. The celebration lasted until sunset, until the courtyard glowed with string lights that the tenant association had installed, until the children were tired and the stories were told and the plates were empty. As people filtered back to their apartments, the building stood as it had for 80 years, brick and mortar. Yes, but also memory and resistance. Proof that ordinary people doing ordinary things consistently can build something that money cannot buy and paperwork cannot erase. Benjamin and Dorothy climbed 4 flights to their apartment. The elevator worked now, but old habits persisted. They passed the door frame where pencil marks still measured a boy's growth. They touched the photograph on the refrigerator, the same ritual, different meaning. They sat in the same chairs they had sat in for 23 years, in the home they had fought to keep, in the city that had tried to price them out and failed. And in that apartment, in that building, in that neighborhood, dignity lived not as abstraction, but as daily practice, the refusal to be erased. The insistence on being seen, the stubborn belief that people who look like them, who love like them, who document like them, deserve to remain in the spaces they have made sacred through the ordinary accumulation of years. If this moved you, consider sharing it with someone who needs to see that refusal matters. Justice is less often delivered by surprise and more often built, slowly and stubbornly, by people who record the truth and refuse to be silent. The fight for home is also the fight for memory, for community, for the right to grow old in the place where your life has left marks. That fight requires no special gifts, only the daily courage to document, to speak, to stay. Benjamin and Dorothy Clark stayed. And in staying, they changed what staying meant for everyone who came after.